The Apache stood motionless against the crimson horizon, his weathered face unreadable as stone. 43 years of solitude had taught him that silence was safer than speech, isolation kinder than rejection. The settlers feared him. His own tribe had cast him aside. He had become a ghost among the living, a man untouched by human hands for decades. His days passed in quiet routine, hunting, crafting, surviving, until that blood-soaked evening when she collapsed at the edge of his camp. The white woman's eyes held no fear, only desperation as she reached toward him with trembling fingers. Would this wounded stranger become the first person in decades to see beyond the myths and scars that kept him in shadows? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nakohi rose before dawn, as he had every day for decades. The name given to him at birth, meaning walks alone, had become his destiny, a cruel prophecy fulfilled. His calloused fingers reached for the hunting knife beside his bedroll, the worn wooden handle smooth from years of use. The blade had fed him, clothed him, kept him alive when no one else would. The morning ritual began as always, checking snares, gathering water from the hidden spring, and watching the sky for signs of weather. His camp nestled in a natural alcove between towering red rocks, invisible to those who didn't know where to look, just as he had become invisible to the world. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of his reflection in still water. The face that stared back belonged to a man of 58 winters, though the lines etched into his copper skin suggested many more. His long hair, now streaked with silver, remained tied back with a strip of leather, one of the few traditions he maintained from a people who no longer claimed him. In town, they called him the Shadow Apache. Children were told he would steal them away if they wandered too far into the mountains. Hunters claimed to have spotted him moving like a ghost through the trees, there one moment, gone the next. Some believed he possessed supernatural powers. None dared venture near his territory. The truth was simpler and far more painful. Nakohi was merely a man who had once had a family, a place among his tribe, a voice that others listened to, until the accusation, until the ceremony of rejection, where the tribal elders turned their backs one by one, until the burning iron pressed into his flesh, marking him forever as Nakai, the outcast. He remembered little of that day beyond the pain and the silence. They had not even granted him the dignity of explaining the charges against him. Only his uncle, the medicine man, had whispered as they led him away. The settlers needed blood. Your name was given. For the white townsfolk 2 days' ride away, one Apache was the same as any other. Someone had killed 3 settlers. Someone would pay. Nakohi's lands were closest to the town. That was enough. He had built his life in the wilderness after that, learning to speak to no one but the wind, to trust nothing but his knife and his own 2 hands, to need no one and nothing beyond what sustained his body. Until yesterday, the woman still lay where he had dragged her, near the small fire pit at the center of his camp. Her breathing had steadied somewhat overnight, though the makeshift bandage on her shoulder had soaked through with blood. Nakohi knelt beside her, examining the wound without touching her more than necessary. The bullet had passed clean through, missing bone and vital vessels. A fortunate shot, if being shot could ever be called fortunate. He had packed the wound with crushed yarrow leaves and bound it with strips torn from his spare shirt. It would have to do. She was young, perhaps 30, with hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and skin far too pale to thrive in the desert sun. Her clothes spoke of money, though they were now torn and bloodied. A settler woman, undoubtedly. One of those who would cross the street rather than share a sidewalk with an Indian. Yet when she had stumbled into the perimeter of his camp, when she had seen him standing there like a statue carved from the very stone around them, she had not screamed, had not turned to run, had not shown the fear he had come to expect. Instead, she had reached for him with trembling fingers and whispered a single word, Help! Then she had collapsed at his feet, leaving Nakohi with a choice he had not faced in 43 years. Turn away from another human being, or remember what it meant to be part of humanity. His hand hovered over her forehead, feeling the heat of fever without making contact. He should have left her where she fell, should have disappeared into the canyons and let fate decide her course. Instead, he had carried her to his camp, had treated her wound, had watched over her through the night. He didn't yet know why. When Nakohi returned from hunting, the woman was awake, though barely. Her blue eyes, clouded with pain, followed his movements as he prepared a broth from the rabbit he had caught. He worked methodically, aware of her gaze but refusing to meet it. "Water," she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. Nakohi hesitated only briefly before bringing his water skin to her lips. As she drank, something small and metallic slipped from her clenched fist. A locket, he realized, attached to a broken chain. It fell open to reveal the face of a young girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with the same wheat-colored hair as the woman. After she had drunk her fill, the woman's fingers scrabbled weakly for the locket. Nakohi picked it up, closed it, and placed it back in her palm. Her fingers closed around it like a lifeline. "Elizabeth," she said, touching her chest with her uninjured arm. "Elizabeth Harper." Nakohi said nothing, returning to the broth. Names were dangerous things. They created connections, expectations. He had not spoken his own name aloud in decades. "They're coming for me," she continued, her words slurring slightly as fever took hold again. "Baldwin's men. They'll kill me this time. They'll make sure." Delirium set in as the day progressed. Elizabeth thrashed and murmured, sometimes crying out for someone named Catherine, the child in the locket, perhaps. Nakohi tended to her as best he could, replacing the poultice when necessary, coaxing sips of water and broth between her lips. Through her fevered ramblings, pieces of her story emerged. A husband, Thomas, dead these past 2 years. The powerful rancher Baldwin, whose advances she had rejected. Accusations of theft, then murder. A hasty escape in the night. "She's waiting for me?" Elizabeth repeated, clutching the locket. "My Catherine. She needs her mother." Night fell, bringing cooler air to the desert. Nakohi built up the fire, more for his patient's benefit than his own. He was accustomed to cold and darkness. As flames cast dancing shadows across the camp, he found himself studying Elizabeth Harper's face. There was strength there, beneath the pallor of fever. The kind of determination he recognized from his own people, those who survived when others perished. Her hands, though delicate compared to his, showed calluses that spoke of work and struggle. Not soft, then. Not sheltered like the wealthy women from town, who occasionally ventured to the trading post with their parasols and lace gloves. This one had known hardship. As she slept fitfully, Nakohi removed the blood-stained bandage to check her wound. The yarrow had done its work. The bleeding had stopped, though infection remained a danger. He prepared a fresh poultice, this time adding crushed juniper berries for their purifying properties. The wound needed cleaning. Steeling himself, Nakohi dipped a rag in warm water and, for the first time in more years than he could remember, deliberately touched another human being. Elizabeth didn't stir as he gently wiped away dried blood and dirt from her shoulder. Such a strange thing, to feel the warmth of another person's skin beneath his fingers. So different from the deer and rabbits he dressed after hunting. So familiar yet so forgotten. He worked quickly, efficiently, trying to ignore the unexpected tightness in his chest. When he finished binding the fresh bandage, he withdrew his hands as if burned. Outside the sheltered alcove, an owl called into the night. Nakohi moved to the entrance of his camp and gazed up at the vast blanket of stars. In the morning, he would need to decide what to do with Elizabeth Harper. If her fevered warnings held truth, men might be searching for her already. Men who would kill without hesitation. Men who would certainly kill him if they found an Apache harboring their quarry. The sensible choice was clear. At first light, he should guide her to the edge of his territory and send her on her way. Wash his hands of this complication that had stumbled into his carefully constructed solitude. Yet as the night deepened around him, Nakohi knew he would do no such thing. Dawn broke with startling clarity, the kind that only comes in the high desert. Elizabeth's fever had broken too, sometime in the early hours. When Nakohi returned from checking his perimeter, he found her sitting up, pale but alert, sipping water from his clay cup. Their eyes met, truly met, for the first time. Hers widened slightly, but she didn't look away. "You saved my life," she said simply. Nakohi nodded once, then busied himself with the morning fire. Behind him, he heard her shifting, a small gasp of pain as she tested her injured shoulder. "How long have I been here?" "2 nights," he answered, his voice rough from disuse. The English words felt strange in his mouth, like pebbles he had to work around. Elizabeth seemed surprised to hear him speak. "You understand English?" Another nod. "And you speak it?" "Some." He added more kindling to the flames, avoiding her gaze. "What's your name?" she asked. He remained silent for so long that she must have thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Nakohi." "Nakohi," she repeated, mangling the pronunciation. "What does it mean?" "Walks alone." A sad smile touched her lips. "That seems fitting." She attempted to stand but swayed dangerously. Nakohi moved swiftly to her side but stopped short of touching her, his hands hovering uncertainly. "I'm all right," she insisted, though she eased herself back down. "Just dizzy." From the leather pouch at his waist, Nakohi withdrew a folded paper, yellowed and creased from handling. He hesitated, then held it out to Elizabeth. She took it with a puzzled expression that quickly transformed to shock as she unfolded the paper. It was a wanted poster, her own face crudely sketched beneath bold letters. "Wanted for murder, Elizabeth Harper. $500 reward." "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "Trading post. 3 days ago." Her fingers traced the words as if hoping they might change under her touch. "They're saying I killed a man. Milton Carson, Baldwin's foreman." She looked up, eyes fierce despite her weakness. "I didn't." Nakohi said nothing, waiting. "Baldwin did it, or had it done. Carson knew something Baldwin wanted kept quiet." Her hands trembled. "I was there that night at Baldwin's ranch. I cleaned for him, cleaned. Carson came to the study while I was working. They argued. Baldwin told me to leave, but She swallowed hard. "I heard too much. About land deeds. About bribes to the territorial judges." She folded the poster carefully. "When I heard about Carson's murder the next day, I knew Baldwin would blame me. I was the only witness. I ran, but his men found me." She touched her wounded shoulder. "I got away barely. Kept moving for 2 days before I stumbled into your camp." Nakohi took back the poster, his expression unchanged. But inside, familiar embers stirred, the memory of his own false accusation. The justice denied him. "They're still looking," he said. It wasn't a question. Elizabeth nodded. "Baldwin won't stop. Not until I'm dead or locked away. And if that happens..." Her voice caught. "My daughter, Catherine. She's with a foster family in town. Baldwin's already applied to be her guardian if something happens to me." The implications hung in the air between them. Nakohi moved to the entrance of the camp, scanning the distant terrain. No dust clouds rose from horsemen. No glint of sunlight on metal. But they would come. Men always came, eventually. "You should rest," he said, returning to the fire. "Eat. Regain strength." "And then?" she asked. Nakohi met her gaze steadily. "And then we decide." It was the first time in 43 years he had used the word we. Over the next 3 days, Elizabeth's strength returned gradually. Nakohi brought her small portions of rabbit stew, wild berries, and prickly pear fruit. He fashioned a clay water bowl specifically for her, deeper than his own to require less movement while drinking. Though they shared the confined space of his camp, they existed largely in silence. Nakohi continued his daily routines, hunting, maintaining his tools, scanning the horizon for threats. Elizabeth mostly rested, though he occasionally caught her watching him with undisguised curiosity. On the 4th morning, she joined him at the fire without assistance. "Thank you," she said, accepting the bowl he offered. "For everything." Nakohi acknowledged her thanks with a slight nod. "You don't speak much, do you?" The question held no judgment, just observation. "Not for many years," he admitted. "To whom would you speak?" she asked softly. His silence was answer enough. They ate quietly, the desert awakening around them. Finches darted between scrub bushes. A lizard basked on a nearby rock, its scales gleaming, copper in the morning light. "It's peaceful here," Elizabeth said, breaking the silence. "Different from what I imagined." Nakohi raised an eyebrow. "The shadow Apache's lair," she clarified, a hint of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "That's what they call you in town. They say you steal children and practice dark magic." A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed his weathered face. "And yet you asked for my help." "I was half delirious from blood loss," she replied with unexpected humor. "Besides, dying from a gunshot seemed more certain than the risk of magical curses." The smallest of smiles touched Nakohi's lips, so briefly she might have imagined it. Later that day, as shadows lengthened across the camp, Elizabeth attempted to wash her blood-stained blouse in a small basin of water. The effort clearly pained her, though she tried to hide it. Without comment, Nakohi approached and held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she surrendered the garment. His large, calloused hands worked methodically, scrubbing the fabric with a root that created a subtle lather. "Yucca," he explained, noting her interest. "Cleans well." As he worked, Elizabeth studied his face. The deep-set eyes, the prominent cheekbones, the lines etched by sun and hardship. "How long have you lived here alone?" she asked. 43 years. The number hung in the air between them, its enormity almost incomprehensible. "And before that? You mentioned your tribe rejected you." Nakohi's hands stilled momentarily. "They believed I betrayed them to the white soldiers." "Did you?" "No." The word emerged like stone. Elizabeth nodded, accepting his answer without question. That simple act of belief seemed to shift something in the air between them. "My husband died 2 years ago," she offered, a trade of personal history. "Influenza." Catherine was only 4. "I took work at Baldwin's ranch to support us." Nakohi nodded, listening as he rinsed her blouse. "Baldwin offered marriage 6 months later. When I refused, things became difficult. Work disappeared. Our rent increased. Catherine fell ill, and suddenly no doctor would see her." Her voice hardened. "He's a powerful man used to getting what he wants." The next day brought a new tension. Mid-morning, Nakohi froze while gathering firewood, his head tilting slightly. Elizabeth had learned to recognize this posture. He was listening to something beyond her hearing. Minutes later, she heard it too, horses, approaching from the west. "Inside," Nakohi instructed, gesturing to the deepest part of the rock alcove. "Stay silent." Elizabeth complied without question, pressing herself into the shadows. Nakohi quickly obscured signs of her presence, then positioned himself at his usual lookout, appearing to be simply a solitary Apache going about his day. The riders passed half a mile from the camp. 4 men, heavily armed, one of them carrying a rifle Elizabeth recognized with a chill. Baldwin's men, searching methodically through the foothills. They did not see Nakohi, Or if they did, they gave the shadow Apache a wide berth. After they passed, Elizabeth released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They'll return," Nakohi said simply when he came back to the alcove. Elizabeth nodded, clutching her locket. "I know." That evening, as they sat beside the small, smokeless fire, Elizabeth did something unexpected. She reached across the space between them and briefly touched Nakohi's hand. "Thank you," she said again, the words weighted with new meaning. Nakohi stared at his hand where her fingers had rested, as if seeing something remarkable and strange. Elizabeth's wound healed enough for her to move freely around the camp. One morning, while Nakohi was away checking his snares, she explored the small alcove that had become her sanctuary. Near his sleeping mat, she noticed a leather bundle tucked carefully between two rocks. Curiosity overcame propriety, and she gently pulled it free. Inside was a faded photograph of a young Apache woman holding an infant, a small wooden carving of a wolf, and several eagle feathers bound with sinew. Family treasures, she realized, carefully preserved through decades of solitude. She was returning the bundle when her hand brushed against something else, a small leather pouch containing a curious mirror-like object. As she lifted it into the light, she gasped. It was a tribal rejection symbol, a polished metal disc etched with patterns she didn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. "That is private." Elizabeth startled at Nakohi's voice. He stood at the entrance, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said, hastily replacing the disc. "I shouldn't have pried." He crossed to her and took the pouch, his movements deliberate. For a moment, she thought he might send her away for this invasion of privacy. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the ground and gestured for her to join him. "You wish to know," he stated simply. Elizabeth nodded, settling carefully opposite him. Nakohi opened the pouch and removed the metal disc. "This was pressed hot," he said, his voice low. "Here." He turned slightly and pulled his deerskin shirt down just enough to reveal a shoulder blade. Even in the dim light, Elizabeth could see the circular scar, the same pattern as on the disc, burned permanently into his flesh. "Nakai," he explained. "Outcast. No longer Apache." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "Because they thought you betrayed them." Nakohi nodded, replacing the disc in its pouch. "3 settlers were killed near our hunting grounds. The army demanded someone answer for it. The tribal council gave them my name." "Why you?" A slight shrug. "I was young, headstrong. I had argued with the council about trading with whites." His eyes grew distant. Perhaps they thought one life was fair exchange for peace. Perhaps they truly believed I was guilty. "What happened?" "I was taken to the fort, questioned, beaten." He spoke without emotion, recounting facts. "A new commander arrived. He did not believe I was guilty. Released me." A bitter smile touched his lips. "But the tribe had already performed the ceremony. I could not return." "So you came here," Elizabeth said softly. "I wandered first, many seasons, then found this place." He gestured to the alcove around them. "Good water, few people. I stayed." Elizabeth sat quietly, absorbing his story. "For 43 years, she finally said. "Alone." "Yes. My isolation lasted 2 years, she offered. "After Thomas died, when Baldwin turned the town against me. Felt endless." She met his gaze directly. "I can't imagine 43 years. "You adapt," he said simply. "Or you die." They sat in silence as afternoon light filtered through the alcove entrance. Finally, Elizabeth spoke again. "Catherine is with the Hendersons, a foster family in town. Good people but cautious. Afraid of Baldwin." She twisted the locket chain around her finger. "She's 7 now. Smart. Stubborn." A smile touched her lips. "She remembers me, I hope." "Children remember," Nakohi said with unexpected certainty. Baldwin's petition for guardianship will be heard next month. Her voice hardened. If I'm not there to contest it, or if I'm in jail for murder, he will take her, Nakohi finished. Elizabeth nodded, her determination clear. I need to clear my name and get my daughter back. Baldwin has to be exposed for what he is. Nakohi studied her for a long moment. Dangerous. Yes. You need proof. Carson told Baldwin something about land deeds and bribes to judges. There must be records, papers in Baldwin's study. Elizabeth's hands clenched in frustration. But I can't get near the ranch. They're watching for me. Nakohi rose and moved to the alcove entrance, gazing out at the harsh landscape. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the desert in gold and shadow. We will find a way, he said quietly. Elizabeth joined him at the entrance, careful to maintain distance. Together they watched the play of light across the red rocks, two outcasts united by circumstance and growing trust. Why are you helping me? She asked. After everything your people have suffered at the hands of mine? Nakohi considered her question for a long moment. You are not your people, he finally said. You are Elizabeth. By the second week, Elizabeth could walk the perimeter of the camp without pain. Her body, weakened by blood loss and days of fever, grew stronger with each passing day. Nakohi observed her progress silently, noting how her steps became more sure, her breathing less labored. One morning, he presented her with a pair of handmade moccasins. Your boots, he explained, gesturing to her worn footwear. Not good for desert. Elizabeth accepted the gift with visible surprise. The moccasins were beautifully crafted from soft deerskin, the stitching meticulous. Small beads adorned the tops in a simple pattern. Did you make these? She asked, examining the fine workmanship. Nakohi nodded. Try. She removed her battered boots and slipped on the moccasins. They fit perfectly, as if he had measured her feet while she slept. Perhaps he had. They're wonderful, she said, taking a few experimental steps. So light. Silent, he corrected. Important in desert. That afternoon, he began teaching her about survival, which plants held water, which could be eaten, which would kill. He showed her how to move without disturbing stones or breaking branches, how to listen to the wind for changes in weather, how to read animal tracks and what they revealed. Elizabeth proved an apt pupil, absorbing his lessons with keen interest. She particularly delighted in learning the Apache names for desert creatures. Gacho, she repeated after him, watching a jackrabbit bound across the scrubland. And that one? She asked, pointing to a roadrunner darting through the brush. Toss, Nakohi replied, his expression softening slightly at her enthusiasm. How do you say, thank you in Apache? He hesitated before answering. Ahihi, Nakohi, she said carefully. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion. He nodded once and turned away, but not before Elizabeth caught the ghost of a smile. That night, as they sat by the fire, Elizabeth shared stories of city life that seemed to fascinate him. Electric streetlights, automobiles, moving picture shows. He listened intently, asking occasional questions that revealed both his intelligence and his isolation from the changing world. The last time I was in a town, he admitted. Horses were the only transport and oil lamps lit the streets. The world has changed, Elizabeth said. Though out here, it's easy to forget that. Some things never change, he replied, his gaze lifting to the stars. The sky, the mountains, human nature. As darkness deepened around them, Elizabeth found herself studying his profile in the firelight. The proud line of his nose, the strong jaw now softened with age but still dignified. She wondered how many sunrises he had witnessed alone, how many storms he had weathered with no one to speak to. Do you ever regret it? She asked suddenly. Staying out here all these years? Nakohi considered her question. Regret is a luxury, he finally said. Like salt or sugar. I learned to live without it. Later, as Elizabeth prepared for sleep, she noticed Nakohi was unusually alert, his head tilting slightly as he listened to the night. What is it? She whispered. Men in the canyon, he replied softly. Camping. 3, maybe 4. A chill ran through her. Baldwin's men. Yes, different from before. Moving slower. Searching carefully. Elizabeth's hand went instinctively to her locket. They're not giving up. No. Nakohi's expression was grim. They will search every canyon, every cave. It is only matter of time. We should leave, Elizabeth said, sudden resolve in her voice. I've put you in danger by staying. Nakohi shook his head. Not yet. You are not strong enough. I'm stronger than I was, she insisted. Not enough. His tone brooked no argument. Sleep. I will watch. But sleep eluded Elizabeth. She lay awake, listening to the distant voices carried on the night breeze, watching Nakohi's silhouette at the entrance to their shelter. Our shelter, she corrected herself, surprised at how naturally the thought came. In the darkest hours before dawn, she was startled from her restless dozing by a cry. Her own voice, she realized, emerging from nightmare. Instantly, Nakohi was beside her, a steady presence in the darkness. Catherine, she gasped, the remnants of the dream still clinging to her. I saw her calling for me, but I couldn't reach her. Without speaking, Nakohi offered her the water skin. His hand briefly touched hers in the exchange, the second time they had made contact since her arrival. This time he didn't pull away as if burned. We will find a way, he said, echoing his earlier promise. But first you must heal completely. In the silver light of the waning moon, Elizabeth nodded, her breathing steadying. Ehihi, she whispered again. This time, Nakohi didn't turn away from her gratitude. Before dawn, Nakohi woke Elizabeth with a gentle touch to her shoulder. We must move, he said, his voice low and urgent. Men are searching this canyon today. She rose without question, gathering her few possessions while Nakohi erased all signs of their habitation. Within minutes, the alcove looked as if no one had lived there for years. How far? She asked, securing her locket around her neck. Far, he replied, handing her a small pack he had prepared. Many hours. Difficult terrain. Nakohi produced a folded piece of hide from his waist pouch. When he unfolded it, Elizabeth saw it was a hand-drawn map, crafted with remarkable precision. It showed a winding path through canyons and across ridges, marked with symbols she couldn't decipher. This way, he said, indicating a route that led deeper into the wilderness. Safe passage. They left as the first gray light touched the eastern horizon. Nakohi moved with the silent grace of a man accustomed to leaving no trace, and Elizabeth did her best to follow his example, placing her moccasined feet exactly where he indicated. The terrain grew more challenging as they ascended into the foothills. Nakohi set a pace that challenged Elizabeth's recovering strength, but she pressed on without complaint. Each time they stopped to rest, it was he who insisted, not her. By mid-morning, they had climbed high enough to look back across the vast expanse of desert. Elizabeth paused, catching her breath, and gazed at the landscape spread below them, the ribbons of dry washes, the scattered mesquite groves, the distant shimmer of heat rising from the valley floor. It's beautiful, she said softly. Nakohi nodded. My home. Have you ever thought of leaving? Going somewhere else? A slight shake of his head. This land knows me. I know it. They continued upward, the sun climbing with them. Nakohi led her through passages so narrow they had to turn sideways, across ledges that would have terrified her a month ago. Now she followed with growing confidence, trusting his guidance implicitly. Mid-afternoon brought a tense moment. As they traversed a high ridge, Nakohi suddenly dropped to a crouch, signaling Elizabeth to do the same. Below them, perhaps half a mile away, four riders moved along a dry creek bed. Even from this distance, she recognized the distinctive dun-colored horse that Baldwin's foreman always rode. "They're following our trail," she whispered. "No," Nakohi replied with quiet certainty. "They follow old signs. From days ago." Still, they remained motionless until the riders passed from view. Elizabeth marveled at Nakohi's patience, the absolute stillness he could maintain, like a part of the rock itself. As they resumed their journey, the landscape changed subtly. The vegetation grew a little more abundant, suggesting higher rainfall. The rocks shifted from red sandstone to darker basalt. They were entering territory Elizabeth had never seen before. "The white settlers never come here?" she asked during one rest break. "Some have tried. None found what they sought." A rare smile touched Nakohi's lips. "Many stories about evil spirits in these canyons." "Stories you started?" Elizabeth guessed. He shrugged, neither confirming nor denying. But his eyes held a mischievous glint that answered her question. Late afternoon brought them to their destination. A hidden valley nestled between towering cliffs. A small spring bubbled from the base of the western wall, feeding a stream that nurtured cottonwoods and willows. The green oasis stood in stark contrast to the arid lands they had traversed. "What is this place?" Elizabeth asked, awestruck by the unexpected beauty. "Gashgee Diagai," Nakohi replied. "White Reeds Valley, sacred to the Apache." He hesitated, then added, "No white person has seen this place before." Elizabeth understood the significance of what he was sharing with her. "I'm honored," she said simply. They made camp beneath a natural overhang in the cliff face. As darkness fell, Nakohi built a small fire, no longer concerned about smoke being seen. They were too remote, too well hidden. Over a meal of dried meat and wild onions, Elizabeth asked the question that had been on her mind throughout their journey. "How much farther to the town?" "To Catherine." "3 days," Nakohi replied. "If we travel fast." Elizabeth nodded, her expression determined. "We'll need a plan. I can't just walk into town." "Yes," Nakohi agreed. "Tomorrow we plan." He gazed into the fire, his face thoughtful. "Tonight, rest. You did well today." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her. Elizabeth felt a disproportionate warmth at his words, a sense of accomplishment that seemed almost childish. Yet she cherished it nonetheless. That night, sleeping under unfamiliar stars, Elizabeth dreamed not of pursuit or danger, but of Catherine, her daughter running freely through this hidden valley, laughing among the white reeds, with Nakohi watching over them both from the cliffs above. Dawn in White Reeds Valley brought birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves. Elizabeth woke to find Nakohi already up, examining something he had laid on a flat stone near the spring. As she approached, she saw it was a small collection of dried plants and roots. "Medicine," he explained, "for strength. Long journey ahead." He prepared a bitter tea from the herbs, which Elizabeth drank without complaint. The taste was unpleasant, but she trusted his knowledge implicitly now. Their planning session began over a breakfast of wild berries and pemmican from Nakohi's supplies. Elizabeth described the layout of Baldwin's ranch, the routines of the household, the location of his study where incriminating documents might be found. "Guards?" Nakohi asked. "2 men usually patrol at night. More since." She gestured to her healed shoulder. He nodded, absorbing the information. "And the town?" "Your daughter's location. The Henderson farm is on the outskirts, north side. Simple place, no guards, but Mrs. Henderson rarely lets Catherine out of her sight." Elizabeth's voice softened. "She's protective, afraid of Baldwin, but kind-hearted." Nakohi began sketching in the dirt with a stick, creating a rough map based on her descriptions. His tactical mind impressed Elizabeth. He asked questions she wouldn't have considered, identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities in the ranch's security. Midday found them gathering supplies for the journey ahead. Nakohi showed Elizabeth how to find water stored in certain cacti, how to identify edible roots, how to set simple snares. She absorbed his teachings eagerly, aware that her survival might depend on these skills. They were preparing to explore further up the valley when Nakohi suddenly froze, his head tilting in the familiar listening posture. Without a word, he motioned for Elizabeth to follow him to higher ground. From a concealed position among the rocks, they watched as a lone rider entered the valley from the south. A white man, disheveled and exhausted-looking, his horse nearly spent. Blood stained his left side. "Not Baldwin's man," Nakohi murmured. "Different." The stranger dismounted by the spring, his movements pained. As he bent to drink, something glinted on his chest. A badge. "That's Sheriff Daniels," Elizabeth whispered, surprised. "From the next county over." They watched as the sheriff filled his canteen, then slumped against a boulder, clearly at the limits of his endurance. "He's injured," Elizabeth said. "Badly, from the look of it." Nakohi's expression remained neutral. "Not our concern." "He's a good man," Elizabeth insisted. "Fair-minded. Never took Baldwin's bribes." The sheriff's head lolled forward, consciousness apparently fading. Elizabeth started to rise, but Nakohi caught her arm. "Could be trap," he warned. "Or he could be dying," she countered. "Please, Nakohi." After a moment's hesitation, he released her arm with a nod. They descended carefully, approaching the wounded man with caution. The sheriff didn't stir until they were almost upon him. When his eyes fluttered open, he reached instinctively for his gun, then stopped when he recognized Elizabeth. "Mrs. Harper?" he croaked. "They said you were dead." "Not yet," she replied. "What happened to you?" "Baldwin," he spat the name. "Found evidence, land fraud. Confronted him." He grimaced in pain. "Ambush on the trail back. My deputy." He shook his head grimly. Nakohi knelt beside the sheriff, examining the wound. "Bullet still inside," he stated. "Need to remove." Sheriff Daniels eyed the Apache warily. "Who's your friend?" "Someone who can save your life," Elizabeth answered. "If you'll let him." The sheriff hesitated only briefly before nodding his consent. While Nakohi gathered what he needed, Elizabeth helped Daniels to the shelter. "Everyone thinks you killed Carson," the sheriff said weakly. "I didn't. I know that now." He fumbled at his saddlebag. "Found proof. Baldwin ordered it." Carson discovered the land fraud, fake deeds, forged signatures. His breathing was becoming labored. Baldwin's been buying judges, stealing land from settlers and Indians alike, building an empire. The sheriff's revelations confirmed Elizabeth's suspicions, but provided little comfort. A dead lawman with evidence was no better than no evidence at all. Nakohi returned with herbs, a knife heated in the fire, and strips of clean cloth. The sheriff eyed these primitive medical tools with trepidation. "I've survived worse," Daniel said, though his pale face suggested otherwise. Nakohi worked with practiced efficiency, removing the bullet and treating the wound with a poultice of herbs. The sheriff bore the procedure stoically, losing consciousness only at the end. When it was done, Nakohi washed his hands in the spring, his expression troubled. "He dies anyway," he predicted quietly. "Infection too deep." Elizabeth looked back at the sheriff's pallid face. "We can't just let him die. His evidence could clear my name." "Evidence?" Nakohi questioned. She nodded toward the saddlebag. "He said he found proof against Baldwin." Together they examined the contents. Official-looking papers, land deeds with obvious forgeries, a ledger showing payments to judges and officials. And most damning of all, a letter in Baldwin's own hand ordering Carson's permanent silence. "This would be enough," Elizabeth said, hope rising in her voice. If we could get it to the territorial governor. Nakohi was studying the sheriff's badge, which had fallen to the ground during the procedure. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand, his expression unreadable. Law, he said almost to himself. White man's law. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. It failed you. Failed him. He nodded toward the sheriff. Failed me. Elizabeth couldn't disagree. But it's all we have, she said softly. Unless you prefer frontier justice. Something flickered in Nakohi's eyes. A darkness Elizabeth hadn't seen before. Sometimes, he said quietly, that is only true justice. Sheriff Daniels did not survive the night. Despite Nakohi's skilled care and Elizabeth's vigilant attention, infection claimed him in the cold hours before dawn. His final words were a barely audible plea. Make it right. They buried him beneath a cottonwood at the edge of the valley, marking the grave with a circle of stones. Elizabeth said a prayer while Nakohi stood in respectful silence. When she finished, he placed the sheriff's badge atop the stone cairn. His spirit will find peace here, Nakohi said quietly. With Daniels gone, the evidence against Baldwin became both their burden and their opportunity. They spent the morning examining the documents more carefully, Elizabeth explaining the legal implications to Nakohi. These land deeds, she said, pointing to several papers, show Baldwin claimed territories that rightfully belong to homesteaders. And these, she indicated another set, are Apache lands. Nakohi studied the map included with the documents, his finger tracing the boundaries of what had once been his tribe's territory. This was our summer hunting ground, he said softly, and here, the place of our ancestors' bones. A new determination settled in his eyes. For 43 years, he had lived apart from his people's struggles. Now, their fight had unexpectedly become his again. With the sheriff's evidence secured in Nakohi's leather pouch, they turned to planning their next move. The journey to town would take 3 days, as Nakohi had said, but now they had a new purpose beyond retrieving Catherine. Baldwin will know the sheriff was onto him, Elizabeth reasoned. He'll be suspicious, might even flee. Nakohi nodded his agreement. Need surprise. And speed. From a hidden cache within the cliff face, Nakohi retrieved items Elizabeth hadn't seen before. A medicine bundle wrapped in tan deerskin, decorated with beads and feathers, and beneath it, a bone-handled knife in an intricately beaded sheath. I have not touched these since my banishment, he explained, handling the bundle with reverence. Sacred objects, given by my father when I became a warrior. Elizabeth understood the significance of what she was witnessing. You're reclaiming your heritage. For this journey only, he clarified. The old ways may serve us now. That afternoon, Nakohi began teaching Elizabeth more advanced survival skills, how to move silently even through brush, how to hide their trail, how to communicate without words using hand signals. She learned quickly, driven by thoughts of her daughter and the justice that now seemed within reach. As dusk approached, they sat side by side at the edge of the spring, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley. We leave at first light, Nakohi said. Travel northwest, avoid main trails. Elizabeth nodded, her mind already racing ahead to their arrival in town, to seeing Catherine again after so many weeks of separation. But another thought intruded, one she had been avoiding. After this is over, she said carefully, after Baldwin is exposed and I have Catherine back, what will you do? Nakohi didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was measured. Return here. Continue as before. Alone. The question escaped before she could consider its implications. His eyes met hers, questioning. What else? Elizabeth looked away, unable to articulate the thoughts forming in her mind. Instead, she asked, would your tribe take you back, if they knew the truth? That you were innocent. Too many years, he said, shaking his head. Too much has changed. People can change their minds, she insisted. Forgiveness is possible. A sad smile touched his lips. You have not lived among the Apache, nor among my own people, Elizabeth thought but didn't say. Her status as a suspected murderer, a woman alone, had shown her the limits of white society's compassion as well. That night, as they made final preparations for their journey, Elizabeth noticed Nakohi fashioning something from a strip of leather and small beads. A protection charm, he explained, seeing her interest. Old magic. When he finished, he hesitated, then held it out to her. For the child, he said. Your daughter. Elizabeth accepted the gift, deeply moved by the gesture. Thank you, she said softly. Catherine will treasure it. As she secured it with her other meager possessions, Elizabeth realized something had shifted between them. Nakohi was no longer merely her reluctant protector, nor she his unexpected burden. They had become something else, allies, perhaps, or something more complex that neither had words to define. Later, as the fire burned down to embers, Elizabeth made a decision. Whatever came next, whatever dangers awaited them in town, she would not allow Nakohi to return to his solitary existence if she could help it. 43 years of isolation was enough for any soul. The first signs of civilization appeared on the third day of their journey. A rutted wagon road, fence posts marking property lines, distant smoke from chimneys. For Elizabeth, these were welcome indicators of proximity to her daughter. For Nakohi, they were warnings. He had not ventured this close to white settlements in decades. Each step seemed to cost him something, as if the land itself resisted his departure from wilderness. When they crested a ridge and saw the town sprawled in the valley below, he stopped abruptly. Something wrong? Elizabeth asked, noting his tension. Nakohi shook his head slightly. Different, he said. Many changes. The town had indeed grown since his last glimpse of it. Wooden structures had given way to brick and stone. Power lines now connected the buildings. Automobiles, though few, moved along the main street where once there had been only horses and wagons. Elizabeth studied his face, seeing the subtle signs of discomfort. We can wait until dark, she suggested. No, he replied firmly. Need to see layout in daylight. From the pack he carried, Nakohi withdrew a battered settler's hat, a relic from some long-ago encounter. Placing it on his head, he pulled the brim low over his face. Disguise, he explained. Not good, but necessary. Elizabeth suppressed a smile, knowing it would hurt his pride. The hat did little to conceal his distinctive Apache features or his long silver-streaked hair. No one seeing him would mistake him for anything but what he was. We'll stay at the edges, she agreed. Observe first. They circled west, using a dry creek bed for cover, until they reached a vantage point that offered a clear view of Baldwin's sprawling ranch. Even from this distance, the display of wealth was unmistakable. Manicured grounds, imposing main house, extensive stables and outbuildings. Stolen land buys much, Nakohi observed dryly. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes focused on the activity around the property. More men than usual, she noted. He's increased security. Afraid, Nakohi said with satisfaction. Nose Sheriff learned truth. They watched for nearly an hour, noting guard positions and patrol patterns. Elizabeth pointed out Baldwin's study, a room with large windows on the east side of the main house. That's where he keeps all his papers, she explained. I cleaned that room weekly for 2 years. The safe is behind the painting of wild horses. You know the combination? Nakohi asked. No, but... She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a small key. I have this. It opens his desk. He kept ledgers there, documenting his bribes to officials. Nakohi's eyebrows rose slightly. You took his key? The night I heard him arguing with Carson. I knew whatever they were discussing was important, so when Baldwin stormed out, She shrugged. It seemed prudent. A hint of admiration flickered in Nakohi's eyes. Smart woman. They continued their reconnaissance, working their way around to the north side of town where the Henderson farm stood. It was a modest homestead, small house, barn, vegetable garden, a few chickens scratching in the yard. Elizabeth's breath caught when she spotted a small figure hanging laundry alongside an older woman. "Catherine," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The child looked thin but healthy, her wheat-colored hair braided down her back as Elizabeth had always done it. The sight of her daughter, so close yet still beyond reach, brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "Soon," Nakohi said quietly. They retreated to a secluded spot among the hills to finalize their plan. Baldwin's security made a direct approach to the ranch too dangerous. The evidence they carried needed to reach the territorial authorities, but with the local law enforcement likely in Baldwin's pocket, they couldn't simply walk into the sheriff's office. "The Henderson farm first," Elizabeth decided. "Once I have Catherine, we can find a way to get the evidence to the proper authorities." Nakohi nodded his agreement. After nightfall, "The woman, Mrs. Henderson, is she trustworthy?" "I believe so," Elizabeth said. "She never liked Baldwin, always treated me with respect." As dusk approached, they shared a sparse meal of jerky and the last of their provisions. Elizabeth's nerves made eating difficult, her stomach tight with anticipation and fear. "What if Catherine doesn't remember me?" she whispered, giving voice to her deepest fear. "She remembers," Nakohi assured her with surprising gentleness. "A child does not forget her mother." Elizabeth studied his face in the fading light. "You sound certain." "I was taken from my mother when I was 6, he said quietly. "By government school. 3 years before I saw her again. But I never forgot her face. Not for one day." It was the most personal story he had shared with her, offered now as comfort. Elizabeth found herself reaching across the space between them, briefly touching his hand in gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Nakohi didn't pull away from her touch. Instead, his weathered fingers curled slightly around hers, an acknowledgement of connection that needed no words. Night fell like a velvet curtain across the landscape, bringing with it the perfect darkness of a new moon. Nakohi moved through the shadows with the silence of a lifetime's practice, Elizabeth following closely behind. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might give them away. They approached the Henderson farm from the north, using the orchard as cover. A single lamp burned in the kitchen window, casting a warm glow across the yard. Through the glass, Elizabeth could see Mrs. Henderson washing dishes, her gray head bent to the task. "Wait here," she whispered to Nakohi. "I'll speak to her alone first." He nodded, melting into the shadows of an apple tree. "Be careful," he murmured. "Trust no one completely." Elizabeth moved to the back door, hesitated, then knocked softly. Inside, Mrs. Henderson looked up, startled. A moment of fear crossed the older woman's face before recognition dawned. "Elizabeth?" she gasped, hurrying to the door but not opening it. "Is it really you?" "Yes, Mary. Please let me in. I need to see Catherine." The older woman glanced nervously toward the front of the house. "Baldwin's men come by every day," she whispered through the door. "There's a reward for information about you." "I know. Please, Mary. I'm her mother." After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Henderson unlatched the door. Elizabeth slipped inside, immediately enveloped in the familiar sense of baking bread and lye soap. "You look terrible," the older woman said, taking in Elizabeth's trail-worn appearance. "Where have you been? Everyone thinks you killed Carson." "I didn't," Elizabeth said firmly. "Baldwin did or had it done. I have proof now." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. "I never believed you did it. Not for a minute." "Catherine?" Elizabeth asked, unable to wait any longer. How is she? Sleeping upstairs. She's been having nightmares, poor lamb. Cries for you in her sleep. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. She never believed you'd abandoned her, no matter what folks said. May I see her? Please. The older woman nodded, leading Elizabeth to a narrow staircase. Second door on the right. My husband's away on business in Santa Fe, so you needn't worry about him. He's a good man, but cautious around Baldwin. Elizabeth climbed the stairs on trembling legs. The second door on the right stood slightly ajar, a sliver of moonlight falling across the small bed within. Catherine lay curled on her side, one arm wrapped around a cloth doll. Her wheat-colored hair spread across the pillow. Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as she approached. Gently, so gently, she brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. The child stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For one terrible moment, confusion clouded Catherine's face. Then recognition bloomed like a sunrise. "Mama?" she whispered, disbelief and hope warring in her voice. "Yes, sweetheart. It's me." Catherine launched herself into Elizabeth's arms with a strangled cry, small hands clutching desperately at her mother's clothes, as if to assure herself this wasn't another dream. "You came back," she sobbed. "I knew you would." Elizabeth held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her small body. "I promised I would always come back to you, didn't I?" As they clung to each other, Elizabeth noticed a piece of paper on the small table beside Catherine's bed. It was a child's drawing, done in colored pencils. A simple house with 3 stick figures standing before it. One was labeled me, another Mama, and the third, curiously, had no label. "What's this, sweetheart?" she asked, picking up the drawing. Catherine wiped her tears on her nightgown sleeve. "It's our house," she explained. "The one we'll have when you come back." "And who's this?" Elizabeth pointed to the unlabeled figure. "I don't know yet," Catherine said with a child's simple logic. "The person who's going to help us. I dream about him sometimes." A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. Before she could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Riders coming," she whispered urgently. "For men on horseback, coming fast down the road." Elizabeth gathered Catherine close. "We need to go. Now." "Go where, Mama?" the child asked, fear edging into her voice. "Somewhere safe," Elizabeth promised. "Someone is helping us." They hurried downstairs, Catherine still in her nightgown, clutching her cloth doll. Mrs. Henderson pressed a small bundle into Elizabeth's hands. "Food," she explained, "and Catherine's warm coat. God be with you." Elizabeth led her daughter out the back door into the orchard where Nakohi waited. Catherine stopped short at the sight of him, her eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. "It's you," she whispered. "From my dream." Nakohi looked startled, then knelt to the child's level. "I am Nakohi," he said solemnly. "I am helping your mother." Catherine studied him with solemn eyes, then held out her small hand. "I'm Catherine," she replied with perfect manners. "Thank you for bringing my mama back." As Nakohi carefully took the child's offered hand, his expression softened in a way Elizabeth had never seen before. Something passed between them, a recognition, a connection, that transcended words. The moment was broken by the sound of horses entering the farm's front yard. Without another word, Nakohi lifted Catherine into his arms and melted into the darkness, Elizabeth close behind them. They moved swiftly through the night, Nakohi leading them along invisible paths away from the farm. Catherine remained silent in his arms, instinctively understanding the need for quiet. Only when they reached the safety of a dense thicket, well hidden from the road, did they pause to rest. "They'll search the Henderson place," Elizabeth whispered, helping Catherine into her coat. "Mary will tell them I was there." "She must," Nakohi agreed, "for her safety." "But she won't tell them which way we went," Catherine said with surprising certainty. Mrs. Henderson always says lying is wrong except when it's right. Nakohi's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Wise woman. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Baldwin's men would organize a search, and with Catherine in tow, their movement was limited. The evidence they carried needed to reach the territorial governor in Santa Fe. But the journey would take days they didn't have. We need to confront Baldwin directly, Elizabeth said suddenly. Nakohi looked at her sharply. Too dangerous. More dangerous than running with a child through the wilderness while his men hunt us? She countered. Baldwin doesn't know about the sheriff's evidence. If we face him with it, threaten exposure. He will kill you, Nakohi stated flatly. Kill us all. Not if we're clever about it, Elizabeth insisted. Not if we create a situation where killing us would only confirm his guilt. Catherine watched this exchange with solemn eyes, clutching her doll. Mr. Baldwin is a bad man, she said quietly. He tried to make me call him Uncle James. Said soon he'd be taking care of me. Elizabeth's resolve hardened at her daughter's words. We need to end this, she said to Nakohi. One way or another. After lengthy discussion, they formed a plan. It was dangerous, with many potential points of failure, but it offered the possibility of immediate resolution. By dawn, they had circled back toward town, approaching Baldwin's ranch from the east where the terrain offered more cover. Nakohi scouted ahead, returning with confirmation that Baldwin was indeed at the ranch. His distinctive carriage stood in the front drive, and smoke rose from the main house chimney despite the warm morning. Guards? Elizabeth asked. 4 visible. More inside, probably. He turned to Catherine, who sat nearby examining a beetle crawling across a leaf. Little one must stay hidden, he said. Not safe for her. Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight. Catherine, she called softly. Come here, sweetheart. The child obeyed, sensing the seriousness in her mother's tone. Elizabeth knelt to eye level with her daughter. Mama and Nakohi need to go speak with Mr. Baldwin, she explained. You must stay here, hidden in these trees. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand? Catherine nodded solemnly. Like hide and seek, she said. But for real. That's right. And it's very important that you win this game by staying perfectly hidden. Nakohi approached, holding out the small protection charm he had made. This will keep you safe, he told Catherine, placing it around her neck. Spirits will watch over you until we return. The child touched the charm with reverent fingers. Thank you, she said with unexpected gravity. Will you come back too? Not just Mama? Something flickered in Nakohi's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion. Yes, he promised quietly. I will come back. With Catherine safely concealed in a dense thicket, Elizabeth and Nakohi made their final preparations. From his pack, Nakohi withdrew the sheriff's ledger containing evidence of Baldwin's crimes. Remember, he said to Elizabeth, if things go wrong, I run, she finished. Get Catherine and run. I know. They approached the ranch openly, walking up the main drive in broad daylight. It was a calculated risk. Baldwin's men wouldn't expect such audacity, and might hesitate to shoot a woman in plain view of potential witnesses from the nearby road. A guard spotted them halfway to the house, raising his rifle in alarm. Others quickly appeared, surrounding them with weapons drawn. I'm here to see Mr. Baldwin, Elizabeth announced calmly. Tell him Elizabeth Harper has returned with information he'll want to hear. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for this scenario. One ran to the house while the others kept their rifles trained on the unlikely pair. Minutes later, James Baldwin himself emerged onto the veranda, a tall man with a carefully groomed beard and cold eyes. He surveyed Elizabeth with calculated composure, though she could see the tension in his stance. Mrs. Harper, he called, his voice carrying across the yard. I'm surprised to see you alive. Even more surprised by your choice of companion. His gaze flickered dismissively over Nakohi. Come inside. We have much to discuss. We'll talk here, Elizabeth replied firmly, holding up the sheriff's ledger. In full view of your men. They should hear what their employer has been doing. Baldwin's expression hardened. I don't respond well to threats, Mrs. Harper. It's not a threat, she replied evenly. It's an opportunity to avoid what's coming otherwise. For a long moment, Baldwin assessed her, weighing options and outcomes. Finally, he nodded curtly. Very well, he said. Let's hear what you think you know. Baldwin descended the veranda steps with calculated casualness, though his eyes never left the ledger in Elizabeth's hands. The guards maintained their positions, rifles ready. Sheriff Daniels paid you a visit recently, didn't he? Elizabeth called, loud enough for all to hear. Before you had him ambushed on the trail back to Gallup. A flicker of surprise crossed Baldwin's face, quickly masked. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied smoothly. I heard the sheriff met with an unfortunate accident. Dangerous country, this. Very dangerous, Elizabeth agreed, especially when you've discovered evidence of land fraud, forged deeds, and judicial bribes. She opened the ledger, displaying the pages. The sheriff found quite a collection of your misdeeds, Mr. Baldwin, before your men killed him. Baldwin's composure slipped just slightly. Those are serious accusations from a woman wanted for murder. A murder you ordered, Elizabeth countered. Carson discovered what you were doing. He threatened to expose you, so you had him killed and framed me for it. The guards exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was clearly more than they had bargained for. Baldwin's eyes hardened. That's an interesting story, Mrs. Harper, but it's your word against mine. And in this territory, my word carries considerable weight. It's not just her word. Nakohi spoke for the first time, his deep voice startling the guards. Sheriff wrote everything. Names, dates, payments. He gestured to the ledger. And this, from inside his shirt, Nakohi withdrew a folded paper, Baldwin's letter ordering Carson's permanent silence. Baldwin's face darkened with rage. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he spat, dropping all pretense of civility. I built this territory from nothing. Everything I've done has been for progress, for civilization. You stole land, Nakohi said quietly. From my people, from settlers, built wealth on lies and blood. Your people, Baldwin laughed harshly. Your people are finished, old man. The future belongs to men like me. Elizabeth stepped forward, holding the ledger high. We're taking this evidence to the territorial governor, she announced. Your empire ends today, Baldwin. Baldwin's control finally shattered. Shoot them, he ordered his men. Kill them both. The guards hesitated, uncertain. These weren't professional killers, just local men hired for their muscle and loyalty. Executing a woman and an old Apache in cold blood, with witnesses potentially watching from the road, wasn't what they had signed on for. Think carefully, Elizabeth warned them. Murder in broad daylight? You'll hang alongside him. Baldwin saw their hesitation and snarled in frustration. Drawing his own pistol, he aimed at Elizabeth's heart. I'll do it myself, then. What happened next occurred with such blinding speed that later, when Elizabeth tried to recall the sequence of events, she could never be entirely certain. Nakohi moved like a man half his age, covering the distance between himself and Baldwin in 2 strides. The rancher's gun discharged, the bullet grazing Nakohi's arm, but failing to stop his momentum. Baldwin toppled backward, the Apache's weight bearing him to the ground. From his boot, Nakohi withdrew the bone-handled knife he had carried from his sacred bundle. He pressed it against Baldwin's throat, pinning the larger man effortlessly despite his age. Stop! Elizabeth cried, both to Nakohi and to the guards who had finally raised their rifles. No more killing. For a terrible moment, the tableau held. Baldwin prone beneath Nakohi's knife, guards with weapons trained, Elizabeth standing with the damning evidence clutched to her chest. The only sound was harsh breathing and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Then, with deliberate slowness, Nakohi eased the pressure of his blade, not removing it entirely, but clearly demonstrating restraint. "You see difference between us?" he asked Baldwin softly. "I could take your life. Choose not to." His voice carried an ancient dignity. "This is true strength." Baldwin's eyes widened in genuine fear, perhaps for the first time understanding that his money and power meant nothing in this moment. "Call off your men," Elizabeth instructed. "Tell them to lower their weapons." After a moment's hesitation, Baldwin complied. "Stand down," he ordered hoarsely. "Don't shoot." The guards lowered their rifles, relief evident on their faces. Elizabeth approached carefully. "Here's what happens next," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You're going to write a full confession. Every detail of your land fraud, your bribes to officials, and your order to kill Carson. You'll sign it in front of your men as witnesses." "Why would I do that?" Baldwin sneered, though the effect was somewhat diminished by his position beneath Nakohi's knife. "Because it's your only chance to avoid the hangman," she replied simply. "A confession might persuade the governor to commute your sentence to life imprisonment." Baldwin's eyes darted between Elizabeth's determined face and Nakohi's implacable one. Slowly, the fight seemed to drain from him, replaced by the calculating instinct for survival that had served him for so long. "Get me paper," he finally said to one of his men, "and a pen." Under the watchful eyes of his own men, James Baldwin wrote his confession. Seated at a small table brought out to the yard, Elizabeth had refused to move the confrontation indoors where other dangers might lurk. The rancher's hand trembled slightly as he documented his crimes. Elizabeth dictated specific points he must include, referencing the sheriff's evidence to ensure nothing was omitted. Nakohi stood silent guard, his presence alone enough to keep Baldwin compliant. "Sign it," Elizabeth instructed when the confession was complete. "And date it." Baldwin did as ordered, his signature an angry scrawl across the bottom of the page. Two of his men signed as witnesses, understanding now that their employer's downfall was inevitable and cooperation their wisest course. "What happens now?" Baldwin asked, a shadow of his former arrogance still evident in his voice. "Now we deliver you and your confession to federal authorities," Elizabeth replied. "Not the local sheriff, he's in your pocket. The U.S. Marshal in Santa Fe." Nakohi had been examining the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Riders coming," he announced. "Many horses. Fast." Baldwin's expression shifted to one of smug satisfaction. "That would be the rest of my men, returning from their search for you, Mrs. Harper. I believe you've miscalculated." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Nakohi. Their plan hadn't accounted for reinforcements arriving so quickly. "Bind him," Nakohi instructed the guards who had already switched their allegiance. "We take him now." As the guards secured Baldwin's hands with rope, Elizabeth gathered the confession and the sheriff's evidence. There was no time to wait for the territorial authorities to arrive. They would have to transport Baldwin themselves. "My carriage," Baldwin suggested with false helpfulness. "It would be faster than on foot." "And give your returning men a clear target?" Elizabeth shook her head. "We go through the backcountry." Before they could move, however, the approaching riders came into view, not Baldwin's men as expected, but a different group entirely. Leading them was a tall figure in the distinctive uniform of a U.S. Marshal. "That's Marshal Taylor," one of the guards said, surprised. "From Santa Fe." Baldwin's face drained of color. "Impossible," he muttered. "How could they know?" Elizabeth was equally puzzled until she noticed Nakohi's faint smile. "The Henderson man," he said quietly. "Husband away on business in Santa Fe, Yes? Perhaps not just business. Understanding dawned. Mary's husband, Elizabeth breathed. She must have suspected something about Baldwin all along. When I appeared last night, she sent warning, he finished. Wise woman indeed. Marshal Taylor and his deputies quickly took control of the situation. Baldwin was officially arrested, his confession and the sheriff's evidence secured as the foundation for prosecution. Elizabeth gave her statement, explaining how Sheriff Daniels had discovered the truth before his murder. We buried him in White Reed's Valley, she told the marshal. He died of his wounds, but managed to pass on the evidence first. Taylor nodded gravely. Daniels was a good man, one of the few honest lawmen in this region. He tipped his hat to Elizabeth. The governor will want to speak with you personally, Mrs. Harper. Your name will be officially cleared by sundown. Elizabeth's relief was tempered by a more immediate concern. My daughter, she said. She's hidden nearby. I need to go to her. Of course, the marshal agreed. One of my men can escort you. No, Elizabeth said firmly. We'll go alone. She glanced at Nakohi, who stood slightly apart from the proceedings, watchful and silent. Both of us. As Baldwin was led away in chains, the fallen rancher called back over his shoulder. This isn't finished, Harper. You think you've won, but men like me always find a way. Elizabeth didn't bother to respond to his threats. They were the empty words of a desperate man whose power had evaporated in a single morning. She and Nakohi slipped away while the marshal's men secured the ranch. They moved swiftly through the woods to where Catherine remained hidden in the thicket. Elizabeth's heart pounded with worry. Had her daughter stayed put as instructed? Had Baldwin's searching men found her? Her fears dissolved when they reached the hiding place. Catherine sat exactly where they had left her, playing quietly with her doll and singing a soft song to herself. When she spotted them, her face lit up with pure joy. Mama! Nakohi! She cried, running to them. You came back. Elizabeth gathered her daughter into her arms, tears of relief flowing freely. Of course we did, sweetheart. We promised, didn't we? Catherine nodded, then reached out one small hand toward Nakohi. After only a moment's hesitation, he took it gently in his own. Did you catch the bad man? She asked solemnly. Yes, Nakohi replied with equal seriousness. Bad man will not hurt anyone again. The child nodded, satisfied with this simple justice. Can we go home now? Elizabeth and Nakohi exchanged a glance over Catherine's head. Home. Such a simple word, yet so complicated for both of them. Elizabeth's house in town had been sold to cover debts after her flight. Nakohi's dwelling in the wilderness was hardly suitable for a mother and child. Soon, Elizabeth promised. But first, we need to speak with some important people in Santa Fe. They need to know what really happened. Will Nakohi come with us? Catherine asked, still holding his hand. Elizabeth looked at him questioningly, realizing she didn't know the answer herself. Nakohi rode beside the wagon that carried Elizabeth and Catherine to Santa Fe. Marshal Taylor had provided the transportation, insisting that Elizabeth's testimony was crucial to the case against Baldwin. The journey would take 2 days. 2 days during which Nakohi had time to consider what came next. 43 years of solitude had established patterns not easily broken. Yet, as he watched Catherine's delight at each new sight along the road, as he caught Elizabeth's glances in his direction, he felt the foundations of his isolation beginning to crack. They stopped for the night at a small way station, where the marshal had arranged rooms for them. Catherine was fascinated by Nakohi's every movement, studying him with the unabashed curiosity of childhood. Were you always alone? She asked as they sat together by the fireplace after dinner, Elizabeth having stepped outside briefly with the marshal. Nakohi considered the child's question carefully. No, he answered truthfully. Once I had family, tribe, people who knew me. What happened to them? Some died. Others forgot me. Catherine frowned, troubled by this concept. "I wouldn't forget you," she declared with absolute certainty. "You saved my mama." Something warmed in Nakohi's chest, a feeling so long absent he struggled to name it. "Your mama saved herself," he corrected gently. "I only helped a little." The child shook her head, unconvinced. From her pocket, she withdrew a folded paper, the drawing Nakohi had glimpsed in her room at the Henderson farm. She smoothed it carefully on her lap. "I made this before," she explained, pointing to the unlabeled figure. "It's you. I saw you in my dreams, standing with me and Mama at our house." Nakohi studied the child's drawing, the simple house, the three stick figures standing hand in hand. The unnamed figure was taller than the others, with long dark hair streaked with lines of white. "Dreams are powerful," he said finally. "My people believe they show what lives in our hearts." Catherine nodded solemnly. "That's why I knew you would bring Mama back." She pulled a stub of pencil from her pocket and carefully wrote beside the tall figure, "Nakohi." When Elizabeth returned, she found them still bent over the drawing. Nakohi teaching Catherine how to write her name in Apache symbols. Something about the sight, her daughter's rapt attention, the old man's gentle patience, brought tears to her eyes. That night, Catherine insisted that Nakohi tell her a bedtime story. Though clearly unaccustomed to such requests, he obliged with a traditional Apache tale about how the stars came to be placed in the sky. His deep voice, softened for the child's benefit, lulled Catherine quickly to sleep. In the small sitting room adjoining their sleeping quarters, Elizabeth and Nakohi found themselves alone for the first time since Baldwin's arrest. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. "After Santa Fe?" Nakohi looked out the window at the unfamiliar town, its few street lamps glowing in the darkness. "I do not belong in world of men," he said. "You belong today," Elizabeth countered gently. "With us." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What do you want of me, Elizabeth?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. What did she want? She hardly knew herself. Only that the thought of him returning to decades of solitude while she and Catherine began their lives anew seemed unbearably wrong. "Catherine has grown attached to you," she said carefully. "And you?" The question hung between them, surprisingly bold from a man of so few words. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "I have as well." Nakohi moved to the window again, his silhouette outlined against the night sky. "I am old man," he said quietly, "with old wounds, old ways." "I'm not asking you to change," Elizabeth replied, rising to stand beside him. "Only to consider that perhaps solitude isn't the only path left to you." When he didn't respond, she continued softly, "We'll be at the governor's mansion tomorrow. After that, I'll need to decide where Catherine and I will go. What we'll do." She paused. "I'd like you to be part of that decision." Nakohi remained silent, but he didn't pull away when Elizabeth's hand came to rest lightly beside his on the windowsill. The next day brought them to Santa Fe, a city larger and more imposing than anything Catherine had ever seen. The child clung to Nakohi's hand as they approached the governor's mansion, overwhelmed by the bustle and noise. "It's too loud," she whispered to him. Nakohi nodded in understanding. "Listen past the noise," he advised. "Find one sound, bird, breeze, your own breathing. Focus there." Catherine tried his suggestion, her small face scrunched in concentration. Gradually, her grip on his hand relaxed. "I hear a fountain," she announced triumphantly, "like at the spring in your special valley." "Good," he approved. "Always find the water music." The territorial governor received them in his private study, a distinguished man with a military bearing and shrewd eyes. He listened carefully to Elizabeth's account, examining the sheriff's evidence and Baldwin's confession with grave attention. "You've done this territory a great service, Mrs. Harper," he concluded. "Baldwin's corruption ran deeper than any of us suspected. The land he stole will be returned to its rightful owners, both settlers and native tribes. At this, Nakohi looked up sharply. Yes, the governor nodded, noting his interest, including the Apache hunting grounds he seized illegally. I'll be sending representatives to the reservation to discuss proper restoration. With Elizabeth's name officially cleared and Baldwin awaiting trial, they were free to leave Santa Fe. The governor had offered financial compensation for Elizabeth's wrongful persecution, enough to start fresh wherever she chose. Where will you go now? Marshal Taylor asked as he escorted them from the mansion. Elizabeth glanced at Nakohi, who had been unusually quiet since the meeting with the governor. I'm not sure yet, she answered honestly. Catherine needs stability, schooling eventually. But, she hesitated. Some decisions remained to be made. They spent one more night in Santa Fe, in a modest hotel paid for by the governor's office. Catherine was fascinated by the indoor plumbing and electric lights, technological marvels she explored with boundless curiosity. Nakohi, look, she called, flipping the light switch repeatedly. Fire that comes and goes without smoke. He observed the electric lamp with cautious interest, his expression suggesting he found the invention clever but perhaps unnecessary. That evening, after Catherine had fallen asleep, Elizabeth found Nakohi on the small balcony of their suite, gazing at the stars barely visible above the city lights. Too much brightness, he remarked. Hides the night sky. Elizabeth joined him at the railing. The governor's offer to restore Apache lands, she said. That must mean something to you. Nakohi was silent for a long moment. It means much, he finally acknowledged. But not for me. I cannot return to the tribe. Because of the banishment? Surely with your name cleared. He shook his head. Too many years. Too much distance. His eyes remained on the hazy stars. I am no longer the man they cast out. They are no longer the people who knew me. Elizabeth understood. 43 years had transformed him into someone else entirely. Neither fully Apache in the traditional sense, nor assimilated into white society. He existed in a space between worlds. What about White Reed's Valley? She suggested. It's isolated, but not too far from town. Catherine and I could build a small house there. Nakohi turned to her, surprise evident in his features. You would live in wilderness? After everything. Not the deep wilderness, she clarified. The valley's edge, perhaps. Where there's water and good soil. She met his gaze steadily. Catherine needs open spaces, not town constraints. And I've learned that people aren't always what makes a place safe. The child needs school. Other children. Eventually, yes, but she's young still. And smart, you've seen how quickly she learns. Elizabeth's voice softened. She needs something else first. Healing. Security. As do I. Nakohi studied her face in the dim light. And you believe you would find this with me? The directness of his question demanded equal honesty in return. I believe we've both lived in isolation long enough, she said simply. Different kinds of isolation, but lonely nonetheless. Catherine dreams of the three of us together. Perhaps she sees something we're only beginning to understand. The next morning brought their departure from Santa Fe. With funds from the governor, Elizabeth purchased a sturdy wagon, supplies, and 2 good horses. Catherine sat between them on the wagon seat, chattering happily about the adventures ahead. As they traveled, Elizabeth noticed a subtle change in Nakohi. The rigid vigilance that had characterized him began to soften, especially around Catherine. He pointed out animal tracks to the child, taught her the Apache names for birds they spotted, showed her how to identify plants that could be eaten or used for medicine. On the 3rd day of their journey, they reached the outer boundaries of what had once been Apache territory. Nakohi grew contemplative as they made camp that evening, his gaze frequently turning to the distant mountains that had been his home for so long. Having second thoughts? Elizabeth asked quietly after Catherine had fallen asleep beside the fire. Thinking of change, he corrected. River changes course over time. Not because it dislikes old path. Because new path calls stronger. Elizabeth smiled at the poetry in his words. And what path is calling you now? Instead of answering directly, Nakohi reached into his pack and withdrew a small knife and a piece of wood he had been carving in quiet moments throughout their journey. With a few final, precise cuts, he completed his work, a miniature shelter carved from cedar, large enough to house 3 small figures. New dwelling, he explained, offering it to Elizabeth. For new beginning. She accepted the carving, tracing its detailed features with her fingertips. The tiny door, the smoke hole in the roof, the 3 supporting poles representing the main structural elements of a traditional Apache shelter. It's beautiful, she said softly, but bigger than your old home. 3 need more space than 1, he replied simply. In that moment, without grand declarations or promises, a decision was made. Elizabeth placed the carving carefully beside the sleeping Catherine, who immediately curled her small hand around it, as if recognizing its significance even in sleep. Tomorrow we reach White Reed's Valley, Nakohi said. Good place to build. Elizabeth nodded, her heart full. Yes, she agreed. A very good place to begin. 1 year later, the Apache stood motionless against the crimson horizon, his weathered face unreadable as stone. But unlike that day long ago, he was not alone. Nakohi! Catherine's voice rang clear across the valley as she ran toward him, her wheat-colored hair streaming behind her like a banner. Mama says supper is ready. He turned, a smile transforming his once stern features. At 8 years old, Catherine moved through the landscape with the confidence of one born to it, her moccasined feet finding purchase on the rocky terrain with practiced ease. Te-a-ko-o, he replied in Apache. I am coming. The child grinned, recognizing the phrase he had taught her. In the year since they had settled in White Reed's Valley, Catherine had absorbed the Apache language with remarkable speed, her young mind unhindered by the prejudices that separated most whites and natives. Together they walked back to the dwelling they had built near the spring, larger than Nakohi's former shelter, yet still modest and in harmony with the surrounding landscape. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her face illuminated by the warm light from within. You 2 are late, she called, though her tone held no real reproach. The stew will get cold. We were watching the eagles, Catherine explained as they approached. Nakohi says they've built a nest on the western cliff. New life comes to the valley, Nakohi added, meeting Elizabeth's gaze with quiet significance. Much had changed in the year since Baldwin's arrest and conviction. The stolen lands had been returned as promised, some to displaced settlers, some to the Apache tribe. Word had spread of Nakohi's role in exposing the corruption, gradually transforming his reputation from fearsome shadow Apache to something approaching respect. Occasionally, tribal representatives visited, tentatively rebuilding connections severed decades before. The formal banishment had been lifted in a small ceremony the previous autumn, though Nakohi had chosen to remain in the valley rather than return to the reservation. This is my home now, he had explained simply, gesturing to the small house and the 2 who shared it with him. Inside their dwelling, the evening meal awaited, rabbit stew with wild onions and herbs from Elizabeth's garden. They ate together as they did every night, Catherine chattering about her discoveries of the day, Elizabeth discussing the progress of her correspondence with the Territorial Education Board, Nakohi mostly listening but occasionally offering observations or gentle corrections to Catherine's Apache vocabulary. After the meal, as was their custom, they sat outside to watch the stars emerge. Catherine nestled between them on the bench Nakohi had crafted, her small hand tucked into his large one. Tell the star story again, she requested, pointing to the constellation just appearing above the eastern ridge. Again? He asked with mock exasperation, though all 3 knew he would never refuse her. As he recounted the ancient Apache tale of how coyotes scattered the stars across the night sky, Elizabeth watched his face in the gathering darkness. The deep lines remained, carved by decades of solitude and hardship, but something had softened in his eyes. Something had eased in the set of his shoulders. Later, after Catherine had been tucked into bed with her cloth doll and the carved cedar shelter that never left her side, Elizabeth and Nakohi sat alone by the dying fire. "I received a letter from Mrs. Henderson today," she said. "Baldwin's appeal was denied. He'll remain in prison for the rest of his life." Nakohi nodded, accepting the news without surprise. "Justice finds its way, sometimes slowly. Like healing," she agreed, her hand finding his in the darkness. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the valley, the soft hooting of an owl, the distant yip of coyotes, the gentle rustle of wind through the white reeds near the spring. "Do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked eventually. "Giving up your solitude for this?" Nakohi considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Solitude was not choice," he finally said. "It was what remained when all else was taken." His fingers tightened slightly around hers. "This is choice. First real choice in many years." He looked toward their small house, where Catherine slept peacefully. "The child calls me father in Apache when she thinks I don't hear," he said softly. "Sha'i, does that trouble you?" Elizabeth asked. "No," he replied simply. "It honors me." As the fire burned down to embers, Nakohi reached into his pocket and withdrew 3 small objects. Circular discs of polished stone, each etched with the same pattern, each suspended on a leather cord. "I made these," he said, offering them to Elizabeth. "One for each of us." She examined them in the fading firelight, recognizing the pattern, similar to the tribal rejection symbol he had carried for so long, but subtly altered. "Acceptance," he explained. "Belonging. New marks for new tribe." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she understood the profound significance of his gesture. After 43 years as an outcast, Nakohi had created a new identity, a new belonging, not by returning to his past, but by embracing the unexpected family that fate had brought to his solitary existence. "Our tribe," she whispered, leaning against his shoulder as the stars wheeled overhead. "Small, but strong." "Yes," Nakohi agreed, his arm encircling her with gentle certainty. "Very strong."